Let's talk about how to write a grad school CV specifically for the Master of Social Work program. Grad school CV is slightly different from the typical resume that you would submit for jobs. The biggest difference with the grad school CV is that they're typically a lot longer and they encompass all of your work history as well as academic history. So for those of you who have like research experience, publications, things like that, that would all be included in your CV. Whereas what you typically would submit for the job hunt is typically limited to 1 to 2 pages, and you're going to want to be a lot more selective about what you actually put on your resume. So in this video, we're going to quickly go through all the best practices for writing your social work CV for grad school programs. So let's talk about what should be included in your CV. And I think the best place to start is to talk about what should not be included. Typically, I would say don't include like a skills section, and I'm going to expand on this a little bit more later on. But I find people often make the mistake of having like a general skills section when they should be demonstrating the skills that they have through their job descriptions. The other thing that you typically don't need is like a profile of skills or an objective statement. Those have kind of become obsolete, and I find that most people struggle to write them in a strategic and compelling way. So it's actually better to just let your experience speak for itself, because that's the purpose of your resume. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want in your CV is your education. Obviously, schools are interested in your educational background, and I always recommend putting it first because I find it provides a lot of context for the rest of your experiences. I would also say if you're applying to graduate school, I would advise you to leave off like your high school education, because it's going to be implied that you have a high school diploma if you have, or equivalent if you're applying and to grad school. And so I would just include your bachelor's degree or any college programs that you've attended. Next, you're going to want to put your relevant experience. What I mean by relevant experience is if you've been working as a social worker, you're going to want to put that as your second tab under experiences, or you might choose to highlight internships. A lot of college programs and the BSW program will have you do internships. And I think it's really important to put your most relevant experiences in the social services first, because most employers are going to look like they're going to spend more time looking at like the top front page of your resume or CV. So that's really where you want to capture the reader's attention. Then under that, you're going to want to separate out non-relevant experiences. That way the reader can see like your diverse history while still like drawing attention to those experiences that are most relevant to social work. So even though I mentioned to put your non-relevant experiences second, definitely don't discount those non-relevant experiences, because you have likely gained some soft skills that directly apply to social work. And so when you're writing your job descriptions, you want to really focus on like the soft skills and the insights that you gained through those experiences. For example, when I worked at McDonald's as a teenager, I'm probably not going to write in my resume that I was responsible for managing the till and for keeping a clean environment and making food orders and keeping window times down. Like, that's not really what schools are going to be looking for. What they are interested in is the fact that I gained skills in leadership, teamwork, communication, thinking quickly on my feet and making fast decisions, problem solving, resolving conflicts. Like, all of those skills are things that I did in my part-time job as a teenager that have directly prepared me for like becoming a social worker, and I've been able to develop those skills because I gained them early on in my part-time job. So no matter what like background that you come from, there's definitely pieces that you can pull and focus and really show admissions committees how those experiences apply to social work. And I actually have done a whole video dedicated to this on how to talk about your non-relevant experiences in your Master of Social Work application. So be sure to check that out. Next is credentials and training. If you have any credentials or if there's any, significant trainings that you've done, definitely feel free to include that in your CV. One word of caution though, I do find a lot of people make the mistake of doing what I call credential stuffing or training stuffing their resume. So I will get these resumes and it'll have like 20 different 1-hour webinars that people have taken. And as the reader, it becomes very overwhelming to see that. And also I feel like it kind of dilutes those credentials and training that are actually really beneficial and helpful. Like if you have like a really relevant training that you did in depth and got certified in something and it's buried behind all of these 1-hour webinars, I'm just not going to see it and I'm just going to write off that entire section and be like, okay, this is nothing. So just be very mindful and strategic about what credentials and trainings you actually think will be beneficial to share. Next is research experience, because it is an academic program after all. And if you do have any research experience or publications, schools of social work are going to love to see that. And you should definitely include that in your academic CV. It's one of those things that is definitely not required, but it can really make your application stand out. That said, most Master of Social Work programs are course-based, and so it's not expected that you're going to have research experience, nor will you be doing research in your master's program. So don't stress if you don't have it, but if you do have it, that's awesome. You should definitely include it. Finally, if you speak any other languages, you should definitely include that in your CV, especially in the field of social work where we work with diverse communities. Speaking and reading in another language is super beneficial. So if that's you, be sure to include it in its own heading and include the fluency that you have as well. So whether you are fluent or intermediate or beginner in both speaking and writing in those additional languages. So now that you know what to include in your CV, let's talk about how to actually write your job descriptions. I feel like this is something that people struggle with. The first thing I want to say is don't copy the job description that you got from your employer verbatim. I find that those job descriptions are not optimized for a resume, and they're often filled with a lot of jargon and very specific job duties that aren't going to apply to what the general reader is going to be looking for. So although they often sound good and they're worded nicely, they don't actually it's really not the best approach to just copy and paste those job descriptions into your resume. You can definitely use them for inspiration, and if you do have a job description, I would maybe cross-reference it with the structure that I'm going to suggest that you do instead. So the first thing you want to do when writing your job descriptions is tell the reader what you do. You wouldn't believe how many resumes I have seen where people just start listing roles and responsibilities without providing context and without telling me as the reader what you actually do. As a result, I'll read a job description and be like, okay, what's your job? What do you actually do? For example, they'll start their job description with something like maintained accurate case notes in a timely manner. And then all of their job descriptions just sound exactly like that. And you're like, okay, great. That's awesome that these were your skills. Who were you working with? What were you doing? What was your job? So the best approach that I always recommend is thinking about what would you tell a friend or family member when they ask what you do for work. That should be your first line in your job description. So here's an example. provided clinical social work services rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy with adult clients experiencing addiction, depression, anxiety, trauma, abuse, and loss. Another example is case management, service coordination, support, advocacy, and referrals for families who have a child with autism spectrum disorder. That might be a little bit more fancy and more strongly worded than what you might say to a friend. But as the reader, I understand in that first one, okay, this person's a therapist who's doing cognitive behavioral therapy. And in the second one, this person is like a case manager for families who have a child with autism spectrum disorder. Like the first line in the job description should be very clear about like who you're working with and what you're actually doing. The next thing you want to do is highlight social work skills within your job descriptions. Remember how I mentioned that you shouldn't just have a job description section in your resume where you simply list off skills. Instead, what you should be doing is using soft skills to describe some of the roles and responsibilities that you had. So for example, maybe you want to say practiced active listening and communication skills as a therapist supporting X group. Number 3 is keep your job descriptions short and sweet. And I think this is kind of tied to the idea of don't copy the job description that was given by your employer, which is usually like, 20 to 30 lines of text about your roles and responsibilities. You want to be very strategic about like what you actually put in your job descriptions. And I can share my perspective here because I have been on both sides of the table. I have edited many CVs. I have also been in a position where I was hiring many students within the social services field. And so I read a lot of social work resumes. And I found that when people submitted resumes where their job descriptions were like 10 to 12 points long, guess what? I just didn't read it. And most of the time that first line didn't even tell me like what the actual job that person was doing was. And so I really just didn't have the time or energy to try to decipher all of those lines of text to figure out what that person did for work. It's so true when they say that employers spend 5 to 7 seconds scanning resumes, and they might do a little bit deeper once you kind of pass the initial like scan test. But yeah, as the reader, it gets really overwhelming when you have like a lot of words on the page. So it's better to have like 3 to 5 lines of very strategic descriptions that tell the reader what you were doing and what skills you learned. Obviously, this is more of a rule of thumb than like a hard rule. And there's definitely exceptions that exist. So for example, if you have been in a job for like 10 years and it's very difficult for you to encompass and showcase like the breadth of experience that you had, maybe that one does deserve the full 10 lines. And then other job descriptions might only be like 1 to 2 lines because you just maybe weren't there as long and didn't develop as many skills. Or maybe you had like a super low commitment volunteer opportunity, and that one is literally only going to take up 1 line because it's all it needs. So try to be really thoughtful about like how much needs to be expressed under each job description to really show the reader like the skills that you've gained from each role. Okay, so up to this point, you know what you need to do for the content of your resume. We talked about like what headings you should include and then how to create compelling job descriptions. So next is how do you actually format your social work grad school CV? I have 5 major tips for you in terms of formatting. The first one is keep your template simple and professional. I find a lot of people choose templates that are very busy and overwhelming. And the other issue is that some of those really fancy templates are actually a lot harder to use, and you end up with elements that you don't actually need. I often see people use a template where there's like a column down the side and it has like, that's where they have all their contact information. And then they end up with like skills and personal interests and all these extra elements that they actually really don't need. But then if you remove it, it ends up looking kind of empty and awkward. Honestly, I find that the best templates are simple Microsoft Word that are, black and white and text only. I do have a resume and CV template that follows all of the social work best practices, as well as a training on how to use it. So if you are wanting a template that follows social work best practices, you can grab it I'll put it in the link in the description. And I already mentioned this, but most grad school CVs are typically longer than what you would submit for your job search. So don't worry too much about trying to make everything perfect and fit onto 2 pages. Take up the space that you need because most schools are okay with you using it. That said, some schools do have different recommendations. So if they provide any structure or recommendations for how they want, or if they provide you with any templates as well, I would definitely follow any advice that they give. Also, never include your full address in your CV or your resume for your job search. The reason you should never include your address is because it's really not needed. In today's age, everything that we do in terms of the job search is pretty much digital. You're going to be applying online and you're going to be communicating over email. Back in the day before the internet, they of course needed your address so that they could correspond via snail mail, but that's not a thing anymore. And the other thing too is that it gives them access to information that could potentially lead to bias, specifically based on where you live, right? Do they need to know what neighborhood you live in? And what are they going to assume, good or bad, based on the neighborhood that you live in? And it can be simple things too, right? Even things like your commute. They might make judgments about how far your commute is and whether they think that that's too far, regardless of whether you are okay with that commute or not. But basically, you just want to get rid of that because it just reduces that possibility of them being biased based on where you live. Number 4 is don't say references available upon request. Whether you're applying to social work jobs or Master of Social Work programs, references are part of the process. So saying by request is really quite irrelevant because they're going to need your references to take the next step with you. So save yourself the word space and just delete that from your resume. Finally, keep your formatting consistent and edit thoroughly. Sometimes when we spend so much time working on a document, we stop seeing mistakes. And so it's really important to have somebody that you trust review your resume or CV for the formatting and making sure that all of your headings and job descriptions and bullet points, that they all look consistent and that your resume is easy on the eyes to read, and also to catch any spelling or grammar mistakes. And shameless plug, but I do offer resume editing and critiquing services. So if you are interested in that, I'll put some information in the description as well. But honestly, even if you don't work with me, have somebody look at your resume for you. Okay, we covered a lot of ground in this video. I basically just told you everything that I could think of for best practices for writing your social work resume based on my experience as somebody who reviews a lot of resumes, as well as somebody who has been on the other side of the table and somebody who used to review a lot of resumes and hire people for roles within the social services. Hope this was helpful, and if you have any other questions, drop them in the comments.